April 4, 1943, World War II. A formation of American B-24 Liberator bombers takes off from Solak airfield in Libya on a mission to bomb the Italian-held port of Naples. It's the crew's first combat mission. The 9 men aboard the Lady Be Good, brand new bomber that has never seen combat, are nervous but confident. The raid on Naples is successful. The bombers drop their payloads and turn back toward Libya, flying over 400 miles of Mediterranean Sea in the darkness. But as the formation approaches the North African coast, weather conditions deteriorate, visibility drops, radio communications become difficult. One by one, the planes find their way back to base, all except one. The Lady Be Good never returns. 9 men vanish into the night. The Army Air Force lists them as missing, presumed dead, lost somewhere over the Mediterranean. A tragic but common story in wartime. Their families grieve. Their names are added to the long list of those who never came home. And that should have been the end of the story. Except it wasn't, because 15 years later, in 1958, a British oil exploration team flying over one of the most desolate regions of the Libyan desert spots something impossible. An aircraft, sitting upright in the sand, looking almost pristine, as if it had just landed moments ago. It's the Lady Be Good, 440 miles inland from the coast, deep in the Sahara Desert, in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The plane is virtually intact. The guns are still loaded. The radio still works. There's food, water, and supplies inside. It looks like the crew just stepped out for a moment and will be right back. But the crew has been dead for 15 years. And when investigators piece together what happened, they uncover one of the most haunting stories of survival, miscalculation, and tragedy in aviation history, a ghost story written in the sand. Welcome to the mystery of the Lady Be Good, the World War II bomber that disappeared in 1943 and wasn't found until 1958, perfectly preserved in the desert, with a story that still haunts anyone who learns the full truth of what happened to her crew. Over the next 10 minutes, we're going to explore the mission that went wrong, the navigational error that sealed 9 men's fate, the incredible discovery of the plane 15 years later, the desperate survival attempt that followed the crash, and why this case remains one of aviation's most eerie and tragic mysteries. Let's start with the mission itself. The Lady Be Good was a B-24D Liberator bomber, serial number 4124301, assigned to the 376th Bombardment Group, also known as the Liberandos. The crew consisted of 9 men: First Lieutenant William Hatton, pilot; Second Lieutenant Robert Toner, co-pilot; Second Lieutenant D.P. Hayes, navigator; Second Lieutenant John Warifka, bombardier; Technical Sergeant Harold Ripslinger, flight engineer; Technical Sergeant Robert Lamort, radio operator; Staff Sergeant Guy Shelley, gunner; Staff Sergeant Vernon Moore, gunner; and Staff Sergeant Samuel Adams, gunner. These were young men, most in their early 20s, on their very first combat mission. On April 4, 1943, the Lady Be Good took off as part of a 25-plane formation, heading to Naples, Italy, to bomb harbor installations. The mission itself went smoothly. They hit their targets and turned back toward Libya. But on the return flight, everything started going wrong. A sandstorm had developed over the North African coast, reducing visibility to near zero. Radio communications were difficult due to atmospheric interference. The formation began to break apart as individual planes tried to find their way home through the darkness and weather. The other bombers in the formation dealt with the same conditions, but they either found the airfield or made emergency landings in areas where they could be rescued. The Lady Be Good kept flying. What investigators would later piece together from the plane's log, crew diaries found in the wreckage, and flight data is that the crew made a critical navigational error. They overflew their base without realizing it. In the darkness and sandstorm, they missed the coastal landmarks that should have told them they were over land. They thought they were still over the Mediterranean Sea, approaching the coast from the north. The navigator, Lieutenant Hayes, was using dead reckoning estimating position based on airspeed, time, and compass heading. But strong tailwinds had pushed them much faster than they realized. When they thought they were just reaching the coast, they had actually already crossed it and were flying deeper into the Libyan desert. The radio operator tried to get a bearing from the base but couldn't make contact. They saw no lights below, but they wouldn't, because the desert is just as dark as the ocean at night. They had no way of knowing they were over land instead of water. Eventually, as fuel gauges dropped toward empty, the crew made a decision. They believed they were over the Mediterranean with no way to reach land before running out of fuel. Ditching a B-24 in the ocean at night is extremely dangerous, but it was survivable with life rafts and rescue procedures, so the crew prepared to bail out. At approximately 12 a.m. on April 5, 1943, the 9 men parachuted from the Lady Be Good at about 16,000 feet. They jumped into what they thought was a water landing zone where they'd be rescued. Instead, they jumped into the Sahara Desert, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. After the crew bailed out, the Lady Be Good, now pilotless but still in stable flight with some fuel remaining, continued flying. The bomber flew itself deeper into the desert on autopilot or in a gradual descent until it eventually ran out of fuel and glided to a landing in the sand. The landing was remarkably gentle. The plane settled onto the desert floor with minimal damage, coming to rest upright with landing gear retracted, as if it had belly landed on a runway. Then it sat there for 15 years, waiting to be found. Meanwhile, the crew members landed scattered across the desert in the darkness. They had no idea where they were. When dawn broke and they looked around, they must have been shocked and horrified. No ocean, no coastline, just endless sand dunes stretching in every direction. They were somewhere in the Libyan desert with limited water, no food beyond emergency rations, and temperatures that would reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and drop near freezing at night. They gathered together. At least 8 of the 9 crew members found each other. One man, the gunner Sergeant Adams, was never found and is believed to have died in the parachute jump or shortly after landing alone and injured. The 8 survivors made a decision that would determine their fate. They had 2 choices: stay near where they landed and hope for rescue, or try to walk north toward where they believed the coast must be. They chose to walk. It was a reasonable decision based on what they knew. They thought they'd overshot the coast by maybe 50 to 100 miles. In reality, they were over 400 miles inland. They started walking north through the desert, rationing their small amount of water, trying to survive long enough to reach civilization. What happened next is documented in a diary kept by co-pilot Robert Toner and in letters and notes found with the bodies years later. The men walked for 8 days. 8 days through scorching desert heat, with virtually no water. They left behind equipment to lighten their load. They shared a single parachute as shelter from the sun. They encouraged each other, prayed together, and kept walking. Toner's diary entries are heartbreaking in their matter-of-fact descriptions of their deteriorating condition. Tuesday, April 6th. All of us pretty weary. No travel at night. 1 parachute. No water or food. Everybody getting weak. Wednesday, April 7th. Rested until 5 o'clock. Sun very warm. No breeze. Spent another night here. Thursday, April 8th. Hit sand dunes. Still going north. Very little water left. Nights are cold. Good sign, I think. The entries continue, each one shorter. The handwriting becoming shakier as dehydration and exhaustion set in. They walked approximately 85 miles north from where they landed. An incredible distance given their condition. But it wasn't nearly enough. One by one, the men began to collapse. Dehydration causes confusion, hallucinations, organ failure. They knew they were dying. The final diary entry, April 12th, 8 days after bailing out. No help yet. Very cold night. That was the last entry. Robert Toner died shortly after writing those words, along with several other crew members. A few men managed to walk a bit further. The bodies were found scattered over several miles, suggesting the survivors split up in their final desperate hours, or that some died and others kept going for another day or two. The last survivor probably died around April 13th or 14th, 9 or 10 days after bailing out of the plane. Their bodies lay in the desert, mummified by the dry heat. Their airplane sat 85 miles south, pristine and waiting, and nobody knew where any of them were. Fast forward to November 9th, 1958. 15 years have passed. A British petroleum oil exploration team is conducting aerial surveys of the Libyan desert when they spot something that doesn't belong. Metal, geometric shapes, definitely man-made, in an area where nothing should exist. They fly lower and can't believe what they're seeing. An intact World War II bomber sitting in the sand. They report the discovery, and within weeks, a US Air Force recovery team arrives to investigate. What they found was astonishing. The Lady Be Good was in remarkable condition. The desert had preserved it almost perfectly. The exterior paint was faded and sandblasted, but structurally the plane was sound. The landing gear were up. indicating the crew had prepared for a controlled belly landing, but there was no crew aboard. The guns were still loaded with ammunition. The radio equipment was intact and, incredibly, still functional when powered. There was coffee in a thermos that was still liquid. A flask of water was found, still drinkable. Emergency rations were untouched. The plane looked like the crew had just walked away moments ago, not 15 years ago. Inside the plane, investigators found the flight log, maps, and personal effects that helped them identify the aircraft and crew. But where were the bodies? The discovery of the plane led to intensive searches of the surrounding desert. In February 1960, a ground expedition found the first remains, 5 crew members found together, about 85 miles northwest of the plane. They had clearly died together, probably within hours of each other. 8 days after bailing out, their bodies were mummified by the dry desert air, and personal items including Robert Toner's diary were found with them. Over the following years, 3 more bodies were discovered at various distances from the crash site, indicating they had either split from the group or died separately while trying to continue walking. The body of Sergeant Adams, the gunner, has never been found and is still listed as missing. The 8 recovered crew members were returned to the United States and buried with military honors. The families, who had spent 15 years not knowing what happened to their loved ones, finally had answers and closure, though those answers were almost more painful than not knowing. To learn that your son or husband had survived the bailout, only to die of thirst walking through a desert they didn't even know they were in, that's a special kind of tragedy. The Lady Be Good herself became a subject of intense interest. The Air Force studied the plane extensively. How had it survived 15 years in the desert in such good condition? What could be learned from it? Parts were salvaged, engines were removed and tested, and remarkably, after minor servicing, they ran perfectly. Instruments were recovered. The plane had become a time capsule, a perfectly preserved example of World War II aviation technology. Eventually, what remained of the Lady Be Good was left in the desert, where it slowly deteriorated over subsequent decades. By the 1990s, little remained but scattered debris and the landing gear. The desert that had preserved it for so long eventually reclaimed it. The story of the Lady Be Good raises haunting questions. What if the crew had stayed with the plane instead of walking? They would have died anyway. No one was searching 400 miles inland in the desert. And without water, they couldn't have survived more than a few days. What if they had walked south instead of north, back toward the plane? Would they have found it? Probably not. 5 miles through the desert without water is an impossible distance, and they had no way of knowing which direction the plane had gone. What if the weather had been clear that night in 1943? They would have seen land below them, realized their navigational error, and possibly made it home safely. The tragedy of the Lady Be Good is one of cascading errors and terrible luck. A sandstorm that obscured visibility, strong tailwinds that pushed them farther and faster than expected, radio equipment that couldn't get a clear signal, a navigational miscalculation in an era before GPS or modern navigation aids, the decision to bail out over what they believed was water, and then the cruel irony that the plane they abandoned survived the landing perfectly while they died walking through a desert they didn't even know existed. There's something deeply haunting about the image of that plane sitting in the desert for 15 years, intact and waiting, while the bones of her crew lay scattered miles away in the sand. It's like a ghost story made Ryler machine, outlasting the men who flew her, preserved as if frozen in time while her crew returned to dust. Visitors who saw the Lady Be Good before she disintegrated reported an eerie feeling, a sense of presence, as if the spirits of the crew were still there, still waiting for rescue that would never come. The Lady Be Good story has become legendary in aviation circles. It's taught in survival training as an example of how cascading errors can lead to tragedy. It's discussed in navigation courses as a cautionary tale about the importance of accurate position awareness. And it's told as a ghost story, the phantom plane in the desert, the crew that walked 85 miles to their deaths, the perfectly preserved bomber that seemed to be waiting for men who would never return. The crew of the Lady Be Good were heroes who did their duty, bombed their target, and tried to make it home. They made the best decisions they could with the information they had. In different circumstances, if they'd been over water, as they believed, if rescue had come, if they'd had just a little more water, they might have survived. Instead, they became one of World War II's most tragic and mysterious losses, their story hidden for 15 years, until the desert gave up its secret. Today, The Lady Be Good is mostly gone, scattered by wind and scavengers, reclaimed by the Sahara. But the story lives on as a reminder of the courage of World War II aircrews, the unforgiving nature of the desert, and the strange ways that history sometimes preserves its tragedies. The ghost, plain in the sand, the diary entries that documented men dying of thirst while walking toward a coast they'd never reach. The perfectly preserved bomber that survived better than the men who flew Hertz, a story that refuses to be forgotten. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. The crew of the Lady Be Good deserves to be remembered, not just for how they died, but for their courage, their service, and their desperate fight for survival against impossible odds. If you found this story moving, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten history and mysterious true stories. And remember, behind every abandoned aircraft, every mysterious disappearance, there are real people with real families who never got to say goodbye. Their stories matter. Their memories endure.